Hello, honeys, and welcome to our spooky special. Your Halloween treat today is focused on a female surrealist artist because really, what better spooky topic is there than surrealism? You get the psychological and the physical horror all in one. And also, I got excited about having learned a new thing, and since the whole point of this podcast is I love telling stories and sharing this information with others, here we go. In case you wondered, though, sources for today include Yale University, The Art Story, Art News, the MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and others. Since it's worked well the last couple of times, we're going to do a blend of biography and artwork. We're going to look at specific paintings across her career to look at how she's doing what she was doing at different points in her life. The artist known today as Remedios Varo was born in December of 1908 in the small town of Angles, which is in the northeastern part of Catalonia in Spain, under the name Maria de los Remedios Alicia Rodrigo Varo y Uranga. Her father, Rodrigo Varo y Zavalho, is notable because his work as a hydraulic engineer often necessitated moving the family throughout Spain as well as North Africa. This meant that there were constant disruptions in her life, which had a pretty profound effect on Varo. For example, according to our sources, she kept a childhood postcard of Angles all her life. Her father was also notable because he was likely the source of her performative behavior that she became known for. Varo herself said that he was a major practical joker. Her mother, whose name I was not able to find, was an ardent Catholic, but Varo herself found Catholicism claustrophobic, and she gravitated instead towards relatively more open and universalist beliefs, more in line with her father that way. Her early artistic training actually began in early childhood. Her father would ask her to copy technical plans and architectural diagrams from his various projects with extreme attention to detail. This was likely the start of her lifelong perfectionist trait. But she quickly developed a passion for non-technical work as well, more figurative stuff. Our sources for today quote Varo saying, "At the age of 12, I painted my first painting of my grandmother, which met an understanding response from my father," end quote. At the age of only 15, aka the year 1924, she was admitted to the Real Academia de las Bellas Artes de San Fernando in Madrid. This is remarkable because that was a time when still few women were allowed into art school. It was also important because she found her experiences at the Real Academia and living in the city very freeing, very inspiring. A sort of funny tangential historical parallel, the year she was admitted was the very same year that Dali was expelled. Unlike him, though, Varo was known for following the rules. Her interest in art historical masters of the past and influences that she gained from artists like Greco, Goya, and Bosch. Moving right along to her 20s, aka the decade of the 1930s, Remedios Varo marries Gerardo Lizarraga in 1930. He was a fellow art student and political activist. In 1931, the couple moves to Paris because of her admitted fascination with and draw towards the life of the poor bohemians, confident and carefree, as she put it. This move ends up being an important one in her life and career for many reasons. One historical one is that Varo recorded many of the cafe-set philosophical conversations between avant-garde artists happening at the time. Yet within a few years, the couple returns to Spain and the Barcelona-based avant-garde. Her personal life before and after the move increasingly reflects this avant-garde draw. For example, she did a lot of the exquisite corpse games that were popular amongst surrealists all over Europe at the time. Varo also begins to revolt against conventional norms in her personal life. She begins a relationship with the Spanish surrealist painter Esteban Frances while still married to Lizarraga. All of them supposedly remain on good terms, though. In 1936, Varo exhibits with the Logicophobists, a group of artists who sought the union of art with metaphysics. In her opinion, accomplishing this union would mean the group had really done, quote, everything possible to make something fully surrealist, end quote. Also that year, she met Benjamin Perret, who, in my opinion, looks very much like Danny DeVito as Batman's Penguin. Perret was a surrealist poet and a close friend of André Breton, major arts world figure, as well as a political activist and supporter of the Spanish Republic. In 1937, Varo went to Paris with him, and although the two were deeply in love, they were very poor. Varo wrote in her journals at one point, quote, "It is not easy to live on painting in Paris. Sometimes I did not have more food in an entire day than a small cup of coffee with milk," unquote. They faced a lot of political uncertainty also with his activism. The two stick it out, but they really struggle while they do. In spite of their setbacks, Varo continues to grow her career and networks across these 2 to 3 years-ish. One big boost is that Perret introduces her to the inner circle of Surrealism. The sad part about that is that she felt kind of intimidated. She felt her position was more that of a humble listener, in her own words. Despite how in line with their beliefs she really was, she never felt like an equal. Varo also studies science, psychology, sacred geometry, and the I Ching at the time, combining those with the mystical works of George Gurdjieff, P.D. Ouspensky, and Meister Eckhart. So clearly, Varo was not only intellectually, she was also spiritually minded. And her artistic output during this time was understandably relatively small, partially because of her poverty and self-doubt. Yet Varo still was featured in some major Surrealist exhibitions throughout those years, experimenting with the same techniques as her more popular Surrealist friends, for example, Max Ernst, René Magritte, Victor Bronner, and Wolfgang Paulin. And here, honeys, we arrive at our first artwork, the 1938 The Souls of the Mountain. This is a key artwork because it shows her trying out said experimental techniques used by other Surrealists. In this case, we see her use fumage, F-U-M-A-G-E, developed by Wolfgang Paulin, wherein one uses a candle flame to leave sooty marks across a freshly painted canvas. The core idea of this technique, what makes it surrealist, is that the artist has, at best, limited control over its results. Therefore, this sort of thing represents, in the surrealist artist's mind, a bit of chance, but also the subconscious. Varo takes the technique further, though, by playing with layers. She has parts that are fumage and parts that are clouds painted over it. She also works in the scene's mountain peaks to reveal this sort of inherent connectivity between all parts of the image. Our sources for today point out that because the fumage traces the physical movement of her body and the candle, there's an element of Varo's own physical presence in the work that stands out. The image also ties to her alchemical beliefs, namely that one thing cannot exist without the other. That is why we see here darkness as well as light, solidity as well as the gaseous. Many see this image as a representation of the limitations on her despite her artistic abilities. They point to the duality of it by saying, quote, "She stands colossal, equally dormant and vulnerable at this time, overshadowed by a band of more established male artists and troubled by financial pressure and political unrest," end quote. As she's turning 30, we're also transitioning into the 1940s. And what a decade it was for Varo. In February of 1940, Perret is recalled to military service, but a few months later is arrested and imprisoned for his political activity. Because she is his partner, Varo is also considered suspect and arrested in the winter of 1940. Few records exist of her several-month imprisonment, but one of her friends described Varo as extremely distraught following her release. Following their release, both go into semi-hiding and flee the Germans invading Paris by going to Marseille until 1941, when they finally receive the green light to flee documentation, allowing them to move to Mexico. Once Varo and Perret are there, she took on a variety of jobs, hand-painting furniture, restoring pre-Columbian artifacts, working in commercial design, just about anything to support them. The year also sees some evidence of healing from her imprisonment. Our sources say that her friendships she was able to build in Mexico provided a real sense of security for Varo, who was often still anxious, superstitious, heavily smoking, and surrounded herself at home with small, quote-unquote, magical, and therefore significant to her, objects, such as quartz crystals. In 1942, Varo works with Marc Chagall to design costumes for a ballet titled Alecco. And in 1947, skipping ahead a few years here, she goes to Venezuela for work on an advertising campaign on behalf of the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company. We're going to pause here on this 1947 campaign for a moment to look at the artwork Insomnia that was produced for it. We can tell this was a commission because it's different from how her styles established themselves in the 40s and how they evolved throughout the 50s. Here, there's a difference from the typical multi-layered and immersive approaches she was taking at the time. The work Insomnia itself has what's been called a Magritte-like flatness to it by experts, though the flattening instead of adding layers technique here may be related to its purpose. This is, after all, an ad for sleeping pills. The illustration is designed as a visualization of the text description of the feeling of insomnia. And that description goes like this, quote, "Sensing that someone has been observing them, they open tired eyelids, searching for nocturnal shadows. Undefined anxiety fills the solitude of dark, dry rooms, devoid of warmth," end quote. So, of course, this image is designed to feel uncomfortable. Yet Varo attempts to include some more comforting imagery here in contrast to the unease of most of the image, namely the nocturnal insects that are flying towards a singular light source, embodying a sort of hopeful lightness and the message of transformation. We also see some connection to the forerunners of Surrealism. Here, Varo uses a collage-type method of painting, putting focus on converging lines, geometric shapes, architectural forms, and on a sharply receding perspective. All of these are characteristic of Giorgio de Chirico. But I wanted to focus on this image and this campaign for a moment because of its strong impact on her career. Bayer Pharmaceutical Company became a long-standing client for Varo and her principal source of income at this time. Across the collaboration, she created 30 illustrations that allowed her to further explore her artistic interests in representing science. And of course, then we hit her 40s and the 1950s with them. In the year 1950, Varo marries an Austrian refugee and friend by the name of Walter Grün. At that point, Grün was a successful businessman living in Mexico. So why he is worth mentioning? Well, Grün's emotional and economic support allowed Varo to devote herself completely to her art and career for the first time in her life without having to worry about finances. For the rest of Varo's life and career, she was able to create prolifically and focus on what she was interested in exclusively. She starts off the decade pretty strong and in 1955 has her first solo exhibition in Mexico City. Though she only showed 4 paintings, she earned major critical acclaim and some financial success from this event. At the time, the newspaper Excelsior noted her, quote, "spiritual and technical courage so superior to what is ordinarily seen," end quote, and described, quote, "her fervent meticulousness as worthy of," again in quotes, "a Flemish primitive at the service of an imagination bathed in the most exquisite poetry," end quote. Not only did this solo exhibition establish her in the art world as an outstanding artist, it also boosted sales of her work to the point of having waiting lists for the first time. One artwork from the show that we can look at quickly is called Solar Music. The concept behind this image is freedom from former restrictions. That's why we see here birds leaving the cage, made free by the sound waves from a woman's violin playing. The theme is very much in line with her own newfound freedom from having to make money and her own ability to create experiences of art, of growth, of enlightenment. Our sources really emphasize these parallels as well as the harmony in the image, which may be seen as a sort of harmony in her own life. We see here that recognizable, complex, and multi-layered painting style that I mentioned earlier, and it's much more clear and distinctive this time. Jumping ahead to her next individual exhibition, this time at the Salon de l'Art de Mujer in 1958. This exhibition demonstrates how she continues to build her own career as well as other relationships with major arts world figures throughout the decade. And for a little compare and contrast, an artwork from this second exhibition titled Creation of the Birds. In this piece, Varo represents herself as a crucial and integral part of life itself by uniting sound, image, and light, like literally. She demonstrates her power as an artist, an intellectual, and as a bringer of life by interacting with and feeding this figure who represents some sort of spawn of science and art. She is a key part of the circle of life in this image and is clearly feeling her own artistic as well as personal power at this point in her career. Now, I mentioned specific relationships with other surrealist and arts figures, and let's take a look at one of these relationships by looking at an artwork. Here it will be the 1959 piece, Exploring the Sources of the Orinoco River. The piece, of course, demonstrates Varo's interests in the psychological, the occult, and the scientific. In fact, today's sources tell us that the director of the New York Hall of Science, one Alan Friedman, has suggested that Varo's work may have been inspired by her knowledge of the physicist Fred Hoyle's theory that matter is continuously created from nothing. If this theory is accurate, then the water in this painting would signify the elixir of life rather than any precious or materially valuable metals associated with the actual South American Orinoco River. The work also references Leonora Carrington, however, another surrealist. The reference is made through the concept of traveling in an egg to find some sort of source. Varo's reference to Carrington's typical imagery shows their mutual alchemical search for an inner wholeness and a union with the divine. Or at least that's the expert opinion of the interpretation. You are, of course, free to make your own assumptions about the image of a person traveling in an egg. And finally, the remainder of Remedios Varo's life. From 1960 onwards, we're looking at her 50s here, honeys. The year 1960 itself saw her representative, Juan Martin, open his own gallery and show her work almost exclusively. The gallery was so successful that Martin opened a second one in 1962. We'll momentarily stop and take another look at an artwork here, 1960's Dragonfly Woman. This work again makes reference to other surrealists and therefore highlights the theme of mimicry across the artist's lifetime. Here we see a checker-patterned black and white tile floor. This is not only a repeated motif for Varo, it was also one for her great friend Leonora Carrington. Both of them used the pattern to reinforce important notions of opposites combined. We also see mimicry via the reminders of Greco that are visible in the elongation of the central figure in this artwork, especially the figure's arms and disproportionately small head. But Dragonfly Woman again makes reference to her spiritualism interests. This time, Varo includes references to Egyptian figures such as Isis, the goddess of the moon and magic, who here is atypically caged. Again, you are free to make your own interpretations, but it is generally agreed upon in the art world that the message is that woman, or this woman, feels at once defined and confined by her sex. The artwork could also be a reference to the fact that Varo did not ever have children, or maybe that she viewed the potential having of children as an imprisoning possibility. We, of course, will never know for sure. And tragically, in the year 1963, at the height of her career, Remedios Varo dies of a heart attack. But her legacy is widespread, well celebrated, and not going away anytime soon. For many years now, she's been considered culturally significant and has been recognized for her general impacts on Mexican art. The art critics of the publication Novedades called her, quote, one of the most individual and extraordinary painters of Mexican art, quote, after her death. She has had a few retrospectives in Mexico over the years, one in 1964, another in 1971, and a third in 1983. The first major show of hers in '64 resulted in a book titled Obras de Remedios Varo, and it sold out all of its 3 subsequent printings, becoming a highly valued collector's item. A few poems have been dedicated to her, one by Octavio Paz, the Nobel Prize-winning poet, and in fact, another, her eulogy, was by the poet Rosario Castellanos. Her artwork embroidering the Earth's mantle from 1961 was a primary inspiration in Thomas Pynchon's novel The Crying Lot 49 of 1965. The phenomenon of weightlessness was considered so accurately captured by Varo's 1963 piece of the same name, Phenomenon of Weightlessness, that it was used for the cover illustration for The Riddle of Gravitation, written by Peter Bergman, a physicist and colleague of Einstein's. And finally, Varo's The Lovers of 1963 was one of the inspirations for the pop singer Madonna's 1995 video Bedtime Story, along with art by Frida Kahlo, Leonora Carrington, and Renee Magritte. She, of course, had impacts on the representations of her major themes on religion, psychology, and science and alchemy. Once again, Varo was a polymath and very well read in sciences. She felt that art and science were deeply intertwined and that the challenge was to be open to all possibilities across both fields. In fact, this consistent reckoning of spiritual with scientific in her artworks is considered the reason why, in Phenomenon of Weightlessness from 1963, she chooses to show the astronomer trying to work through this discovery and conflict moment. Much like Varo bringing together multiple themes in her artworks, we see this astronomer trying to reconcile a theoretical knowledge of weightlessness with this magical experience of actually being in it. Varo also clearly had an eye for feminism, female experience, and representing both. The combination of three artworks of hers, Towards the Tower from 1961, Embroidering the Mantle, also 1961, and The Escape from 1962, provide focus on and insight into her experiences in a convent school as a young girl. But they are also considered to tell a feminist narrative of a young woman's journey to autonomy. This is because the first image depicts a number of almost identical and very stiff-postured girls following a nun all on bicycles. The second emphasizes the rigid conformity expected of Catholic women through showing girls sitting stiff, sewing together silently. Third image, however, is where we get the feminism, the autonomy, the freedom coming in. It shows one of the young women successfully fleeing the convent with her lover. Of course, there's a bit more than that narrative that makes experts believe this is the female empowerment case. For one, the narrow claustrophobic tower located in the sky is meant to indicate confinement, and that is where most of the girls remain trapped. Experts also believe that all of the girls look the same. There's this uniformity to them because they're meant to be seen as interchangeable. They are all assigned to women's work overseen by male authority in the first two images. And Varo's legacy also continues via the broader and special impacts that she had on the Surrealist movement. As I've emphasized, she became close friends with other European artists and expatriates, including Leonora Carrington. She also became close with Katie Horna and Günter Gurso. They all influenced each other. Carrington and Varo worked especially closely. The pair wrote fairy tales, collaborated on a play, invented surrealistic potions and recipes, and had all kinds of other influences on each other. The pair would often get together with the photographer Katie Horna, and the three became known as the Three Witches for the pranks they would pull. One such prank was actually pulled on the poet Octavio Paz. In that case, the three put ink in tapioca pearls to serve as caviar at a party. The Three Witches' relationship was historically important for bigger picture reasons as well. Theirs reflects an inherent need in female artists to create supportive networks. We find art historical parallels to them in Swedish painter Hilma af Klint's group, established simply as the Five. We find another parallel in Birgit Jurgensen's The Ladies, a female artist friend group who were each other's best critics as well as supporters. Varo's influence on fellow female artists goes beyond her own generation. Her interpretations of and contributions to Surrealism had an enduring influence on the subsequent artists, especially female practitioners. According to our sources, quote, post-World War II female artists resolutely shifted their role from that of passive muse to active maker, end quote. And this was due in no small part to Varo and her contemporaries, who provided these younger female artists with role models to look towards. Varo, Carrington, and other surrealists like them provided an opportunity for younger artists to ride and expand upon the wave of their change, to become pioneers of a new artistic language centered on inner reality, on interiority, on personal experience. And that is the story, honeys, of Remedios Varo, a once-in-a-lifetime Spanish woman with an incredible impact on one of the most infamous and spooky artistic movements of all time. I hope you've enjoyed our Halloween special. I hope to catch you back again soon with our business and other episodes coming out. In the meantime, as always, hydrate or dihydrate and take care of yourselves. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnote. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.